Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this fourth edition of Wednesday in the Word as we go through the book of Galatians and dive in to the fourth chapter. Hopefully, you have your Bible, your pen, and you are ready to go because we're going to pick up with Paul's teachings about how we who are in this dispensation of grace really need to understand and appreciate what it is so that we're not giving anything away. We're not allowing anything to compromise our position with God and the promises that He provides. In the first verse, it says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differs nothing from a servant, though he be Lord over all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so, we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world." Well, just remember that an heir is someone who is sharing in the inheritance of the promises that God has given. That is what the gospel has been outlining or teaching and training us. And if you think of it similarly to a father leaving a will and what he is passing on to his children, if the child is of age, they have complete authority in how they use what they were given. But if it's a child, then often that inheritance is put into a trust that they can't access. They can't get a hold of it until they're of age or mature enough to access that trust fund. So he says, if we're treating it like that, like the inheritance is just set aside for a future date, or that there's somebody who gets control how we get our inheritance, well, we might as well be servants then, because somebody else is going to rule, or somebody else is going to act like we need their permission in order to have our inheritance that God has already given unto us. If they can add rules or conditions to the inheritance that God has already given, then they're really compromising the fact that it was left for us. It was given to us by the act of Christ. So why would we want to require or put ourselves or our inheritance under tutors or governors or anyone who could restrict what we have been freely given by God? Well, that is a great question, and one that Paul challenged the Galatians to think about. So our faith is so full. There are so many things that we've already gained now that are in our hand and in our control, that are not just waiting for us to join God eternally in heaven. They're for us here and now. And if we add all a bunch of rules and restrictions, we get caught up in the works, we get caught up in the rules, and we forget to live freely with the blessings we've already been given. Verse 4, it says, "But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons." Now, that redemption, right? That means to rescue from the loss or to buy rights to set free from service or bondage. So he's saying that Jesus redeemed us from the bondage of the law, paid the price for us so that it fulfilled the obligation of the law, rescued us from having to fulfill the law or be restricted by it. And since we've been purchased out of that lifestyle, we need to turn from that and fully embrace the fact that we now can be received through adoption as sons and daughters of Christ. And adoption then is really placing into the family, right? Not by physical birth, but by an arrangement or a contract, in this case, the covenant of God. So there's a legal act that goes along with our justification that not only makes us right with God, but it makes us part now of the lineage of Christ. It allows for us to have rights to the inheritance that God has promised. We're now descendants spiritually, regardless of whoever birthed us into this world. You know, he really draws into this spiritual relationship that makes it known to us that we are sons and daughters of God. It says, "Because your sons, God has sent forth the spirit of his son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father." That is so powerful to know that we now are in this relationship, and the Spirit is the thing that is proving to us that we have entered into the family. It's a wonderful proof of our salvation that we've changed into a new creature, that we now have a new lineage. We have a spirit who dwells in us, and the Spirit of God is connecting us to our Father, teaching and leading us into this child-father relationship that our new inheritance and our new heritage is built around. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then you are an heir. You are a sharer. You are part of the inheritance of God that we got by the way of blood, Jesus's blood, and not our own lineage, but also because of the will, the covenant was written. And we were written in that in order to have a piece of the inheritance that God has for us all. Verse 8, howbeit then, when ye knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are not God's. But now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. Well, Paul basically highlights here that prior to turning to the salvation of Christ, the Jews were very active in serving, and many other faiths and religions also include service. But he's saying the works in themselves, people do great works all the time, whether or not they're serving a God. The work by itself serves its own purpose. It makes you feel good. The work by itself is a great gesture, but it is not part of salvation and living out the inheritance that God has given to you. He might give you a call and purpose, and that should be moving you forward out of an expression of love for Him, for yourself, for the people around you. But to not idolize the work itself or fall into bondage to having to do certain things, observing all the traditions, observing all the rules. You know, the God with the relationship that you have with Him isn't meant to be bound by traditions. Those observances are a choice, an act of faith that becomes spurred out of the relationship with God, but not an obligation or something that puts us into old ways of saying we have to do certain things in order to keep God from being mad at us. We have to do certain things in order to receive our inheritance or salvation. You know, to keep trying to earn something that God has already given us, a relationship of forgiveness and redemption and purpose. That really takes time and effort away from the relationship, which is the most important thing to God. You know, and the next verses that come up are just very transparent about how Paul was trying to deal with the Galatians and really how human dynamics are when we get in and we're working in fellowship with other people. We, you know, rub against each other sometimes, and we have to challenge each other to think differently and to grow in the Lord as we are working out our faith together. Verse 11 says, I'm afraid of or for you, lest I have bestowed upon you in labor in vain. Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as you are. You have not injured me at all. You know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first. And my temptation, which was in my flesh, you despised not, nor rejected, but received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. Where is then the blessedness you spoke of? For I bear you record that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Well, in essence, what he's saying is when I first came to you, I was imperfect. I knew it. You knew it. My struggles were apparent to everyone. I'm as human as anyone else. But you ended up pledging yourself to me in the faith. You received what I said. You wanted to learn and grow, and you accepted the words that I had, even though I was completely imperfect. But now, when I'm trying to challenge these deep held religious views of the law, you want to treat me as an enemy. You want to reject me and not just the message. You want to push me away, even though you were so willing to accept the message from an imperfect messenger when he came the first time around. You know, this just is that truth that both the message and the messenger impacts what we're willing to hear. And Paul asked them to really think about, what is it about this teaching on grace that makes you want to turn away from it? What is it that makes you want to turn away from me and treat me as an enemy after all the relationship and the development that we had done together? And that's a question even for us today. Sometimes we don't like to hear certain things, even though what is being said is the truth. And he wants to go further from this and discuss who's been able to catch their ear. You know, what new thing did they hear that they automatically receive with open arms that actually put them backwards in their understanding of grace? 17, it says they, and we don't know who they all are, but the people who brought a different message. It says they zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you, that you might affect them, saying if you actually ministered grace back to them, they would have run away from you, but you let them bring this in to affect you in a bad way. It is good to be zealously affected, always in a good thing, and not only when I am present with you. He said, the zealousness that you had when I first gave you this word, that zealousness really should have carried you through, even when I'm not around. If you have a true passion and an appreciation for the truth of the gospel and what it means for you. And when you celebrated when you first heard it, you need to keep celebrating that in your spirit and use it to push back against the things that aren't true. Further, he then really urges them, and he shows this motivation that he has, the love that he has for them. He says, my little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you. To travail is to really be in prayerful pushing, wanting the newness to form in them, and that he wants to be even with them at this time. He's not mad at them that he's having to have this conversation, but he doesn't want to have to be in chastisement. He doesn't want to be in correction. He wants to be right there with them again, to be able to have his faith in them restored and to get them back on the same page, pursuing the gospel together. Right? He really wants to pray for them to fully embrace this, to restore the friendship and move forward with everyone understanding and appreciating and living in the freedom that God has provided. And we have to think then, who are we listening to? Who do we allow to correct us if necessary, to be a vessel and a messenger who is providing the truth? And how do we know the motives of those? Who really is trying to help us get better, grow further, live in God's grace, and who might be trying to hold us back? He continues to get spiritual in this, basically saying, if you understand and are so rooted in the law, then I'll go ahead and use the law and the foundation of the law and Father Abraham to help teach you to see the difference between law and grace. Verse 21 says, tell me that ye desire to be under the law. Do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh. He of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. He said, think about it in terms of looking back to Father Abraham, right? The results of his relationship with Sarah, of whom was promised that he'd be the father of many generations. But in Genesis 16, we see that Sarah and Abraham, they got impatient. They didn't understand. They didn't have the faith they needed at the time, especially since Sarah was barren and beyond the years of bearing children. They didn't believe the promise that she could birth a child. So they went ahead and Sarah gave her bondswoman to Abraham to go have a child. He gave Hagar over to him, and a child was born. And the result then is that you have the one born out of bondage and out of the flesh, having this history of them ultimately always remaining bound and subject to those who are living out the promise. Jerusalem is above all of the ruling of the Mount Sinai area and Agar. Jerusalem has become the mother of all, us being the seed of Abraham of faith. But the destiny of the child born from the bondmaid has been difficult, challenging, and bondage continued to be their legacy. Verse 27, for it is written, rejoice, thou barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which has a husband. So there is a whole legacy. There is an inheritance that Hagar left to her child. And the numbers are huge, but we, in verse 28, we are brethren as Isaac was, the child of Sarah and Abraham. We are children of the promise. It's a smaller number, but the grace and the faith and the promise comes to those who follow after Father Abraham, who became seeds and children of the promise. Said, but as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the spirit, even so it is now. Well, we all recognize that there's an ongoing animosity of people of different heritages. The heritages of religion as an animosity against the heritage of faith. The lands that are managed by those who are the children of Hagar compared to those which are managed through Jerusalem in the children of faith are in conflict. We know that there's an ongoing battle of good versus evil that comes out in the land. And he's saying those who are part of the law, who could not fulfill the law and who have not turned to Christ, they continue to live with those challenges. But we get to follow the promise of Abraham because we became his seed, heirs, children of the promise. And we continue to have that choice today, right? Between the natural and spiritual things, between physical law and the promise activating faith of our relationship with God. We're often in mixed company, right? So to speak, we regularly have a choice every day of whether to fall into patterns of the law or whether to live as children of faith, to look at the world with natural eyes or to look at the world with spiritual eyes, to let the spirit inside of us lead us and call out Abba Father and follow his leading, or to step back and look for somebody else to lead or to direct us. Verse 30 says, nevertheless, what saith the scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. There are two different inheritances. There is the inheritance of this world, and then there is the inheritance that comes from being sons of God, to be brought in and adopted in as sons of God. There is freedom, there is liberty, there's promises fulfilled that comes of faith. There's an inheritance here and now, as well as an eternal inheritance to be gained. And we want to start living that inheritance here. Verse 31, so then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So we want to pursue after that, start living our inheritance now. Paul was telling him that Christ has given us access to all eternity, to his power, to his strength, to God's future kingdom. But we also have to live here on this earth in the meantime. And this earth will either pull us back in towards bondage and old ways and old things, or we can choose to be children of the promise. Focus on putting our faith into action, putting faith into what God said, versus spending time on works and things that aren't required or don't inspire us to draw nearer and closer to God. So something to ponder this week. Definitely think about before we get back together again. What is that inheritance that we have? We all have our own DNA. We have those things we inherited. We understand generational curses that came through our bloodlines. But all of that, we get to turn to God, call out Abba Father, and gain from the inheritance that He's given to us, which is stronger and breaks the hold of our old bloodline and gives us a new inheritance. Lots to think about before we come back together again next week for our study of Galatians chapter 5. Be blessed.